Good evening, this is Spencer Brown recording my Module 10 for AEP 880, which really focused on how you create an environment as a school leader, and an environment that advocates really bully prevention from the start. And this topic is kind of near and dear to my heart. Working in Kansas MTSS alignment, the big thing we preach constantly in the areas of academic and behavior and social emotional learning is the idea of creating a preventative system rather than a reactive one. And certainly with the case of bullying, that's an extremely important thing to do. And the assigned articles were great for really highlighting ways of doing that. And I initially thought that there would be a lot of overlap between the articles, but they were actually fairly distinct in the way they approached some things. I did find some overlap in the ones then that I chose, but the four that were chosen for us by the class were quite distinct, I thought. Some of the things I really I'm going to kind of pull out of this summary was this idea of creating cognitive engagement. You're going to see I bring this up at the end as well, but an environment that is cognitively engaging oftentimes doesn't lend itself to start picking at each other or start bullying each other because I'm engaged in what's going on in front of me. A clear code of conduct for all students. This is the way we treat each other. This is how we have respect for each other. This is the way we do business. This is the way we hold each other with dignity in the system within these walls is really important. And it really starts at the top, and that's encouraging, not just encouraging, but expecting the teachers as well as myself as a leader in utilizing a positive culture. And so instilling a positive action curriculum, as described in one of the articles where it talked about how do you help students understand the value of healthy decisions as well as just treating people positively and having a positive outlook. And then on top of that, layering in positive systemic reinforcement and responses to student behavior. And as a leader, not only encouraging that, but learning alongside them and what that looks like and how to make that authentic in order to build those relationships at every level. And so that putting that in place obviously builds those relationships with the students, but then also learning alongside your teachers will help build a relationship there and kind of practice what you preach. Once you kind of have that relationship, then the idea is that now we kind of have this safe environment, right, where students feel comfortable coming forward and talking about the bullying that they are either experiencing or witnessing. And they want to do that if you, as the other articles highlighted, if you help establish really a sense of community. And so I really thought this was a novel take on it. One of the articles was talking about have class traditions, right? Have class meetings that encourage this discourse and problem solving together to bring the class together and create that sense of community where I'm maybe less likely than to bully someone who seems different than me because they're a part of the community that I'm also engaging in. And then also the culture of respect, which we talked about a little bit earlier, but instilling that then into that sense of community is such an important thing. One of the pieces that I have next on my list here is a social emotional learning curriculum and really taking those SECD standards to heart, teaching kids to self-regulate when they feel a certain way about another student, and teaching them to self-advocate when they're treated a certain way by another student, or in all situations, but in this way, I think about that in particular with bullying. And then encouraging reflective and active listening when people have different ideas than us or are different than us. How do we encourage that learning and listening as something that's really valued by the students and the staff? And that really goes into the next thing about teaching empathy. Another article brought up helping students understand what it's like to, what others might be feeling in certain circumstances. And then another novel one I thought was equipping teacher leaders. And I thought that was really novel because it was interesting that, you know, if the teacher feels empowered to really be that leader, then maybe they'll take that by the horns a little bit more. And we saw in the statistics, like there's clearly an issue with active supervision. And so potentially equipping some teacher leaders might help with that as well. And then the final one that one of the articles brought up was the idea of strategic partnerships, right? We want to make sure that we have the appropriate partnerships to really attack this epidemic of bullying head on. The articles I used, some of them are very similar. You heard me already talk about that idea of leading by example. The second bullet I really thought was profound. One of the articles said, you should know your reality. You should be collecting data to see what's really going on in these walls, where is bullying happening and not happening, to know, just like you would with academics, who are we serving well, who are we not, and how do we improve for those that we're not. Code of conduct you heard in the articles assigned, and then this idea of intentional active supervision. This is really going to be important when we look at the stats of where bullying seems to be occurring. Again, creating that community of warmth and respect is so valuable, as it was highlighted in many of my articles, all 4 of my articles, as well as I believe 3 of the ones that were assigned. This idea of encouraging conversations came up again. How do we encourage people to come forward and have conversation about what they're feeling, even when they're not sure others will interpret it the same way, but they feel safe and they feel like it's an okay place to bring that forward. One of my articles had a really interesting statement where they said really a holistic ecological approach is what's best. And so that means really getting at the heart of the home, school, peers, community. Getting at every level is really the way that you make the biggest impact. And I thought that was just really profound and certainly true. Again, employing that social emotional learning curriculum is just a really important piece to all of this. And then one of my articles I thought was really interesting was about do's and don'ts, and I think it was actually from the student perspective. And so they said, don't focus on what's tattling versus telling, and let us feel safe just bringing you what we have, not feeling like we're going to get judged for what we thought was important. And don't justify the circumstances. You hear teachers say, well, that kid had it coming. Don't do that. That certainly doesn't send the right message about what's acceptable. It certainly doesn't create a community of warmth and respect, which actually, I'm going to jump down to the very last bullet, this idea that if adults are exhibiting an unconditional positive regard for students, they had it coming should never come out of their mouth. And I think that's a really important thing. And then don't overuse the term bullying. I thought this was an interesting one that came up because it is, I think we don't spend the time defining our terms sometimes. And in some ways that actually, I think, kind of diminishes the respect for the situation that a student has that's truly bullied when we begin to call everything bullying that may or may not truly be that. And then the do's were interesting. Clearly, like I just said, define your terms. Do it clearly and do it collaboratively. And then help students have some self-reflection on what may or may not be that bullying. And then again, that last piece I think is just so important. How do you've got to set the precedent with adults that we have an unconditional positive regard for students. Summary of the data, most frequent areas of bullying reported in the data were those common areas, the hallways, the cafeteria, the classroom. The interesting thing is, outside of the cafeteria, maybe, the classroom and hallways should be pretty highly supervised areas. And so I thought that was an interesting stat. It didn't surprise me, I guess, but it was interesting to just kind of pause and reflect on when you then take that next bullet into account, where most commonly the bullying that's happening goes under the kind of category of teasing, name calling, or spreading rumors, these verbal things that I guess shouldn't be flying under the radar of supervised areas. But, and I say I'm not surprised because I when I work with schools, it seems like that is the common occurrence. And so it was interesting then to me to hear, 20-30% only were reported. And so then that kind of made me pause to reflect on, okay, what percent of the time is this actually supervised? And not only that, but like what percent of the time is this observed by teachers? Is there times it's not reported because the student's sitting there saying, you saw it? And so I thought that was just an interesting it caused a lot of questions for me. I don't want to make too many inferences on just the data, but it certainly caused questions for me. I also thought it was interesting that I know that it said emails or blogging, which was very low percentage. And I looked, and it looked like the study was fairly recent, so I'm not too surprised that those weren't frequent. But I would be interested to know where social media might come into play in today's day. So what's missing? Obviously, what's missing is active supervision. Obviously there has to be adults in the room, but whether they're truly utilizing true active supervision, it would be clear they're not if that's where all the bullying is taking place, unless it's just very small numbers in general. But I don't believe that that's the case necessarily. The social media data, again, that was kind of missing for me. I'd really like to see what that might come back as now. And then obviously what is missing I don't know if it's missing in this particular study, but what seems to be missing in schools that I go into is still that even knowing what the SECD standards are is still pretty rare. It's less rare than a few years ago, but it is still fairly rare. And so whether it's being instructed or not, I think that there's still this lack of consistency in terms of creating this code of conduct, this encouraging conversation, speaking out, self-regulation, self-advocacy. Clearly the things that were in the articles that said, this is the way you create that preventative environment. That is what's missing. So the steps to remedy this, and it goes right along with Standard C, but the idea that if the standard is followed, what would happen? And so if we truly create that sustained environment of acceptance, respect, being cared for and encouraged to be a responsible member of such a community, well, then students would be standing up for each other. It wouldn't just be 20 to 30% reporting. Students would feel safe sharing their story and coming forward with others. And also they themselves would have more awareness and prevention, because they should be self-aware and understand that if I have respect for this person, that changes the way I interact with them. I'd be if I'm meeting a range of needs within the classroom and the community. This goes back to that I think it was the very first point I talked about, but when I create that sense of cognitive engagement, that oftentimes reduces misbehaviors, which should include those bullying behaviors. And then when I'm able to meet those needs in the community with meeting those physical health needs, that's a huge piece of an overall just healthy student, which would reduce those, again, misbehaviors and bullying behaviors. And then finally, that idea of if I follow the standard, I promote those adult-student relationships in a healthy manner, then that encourages and it fosters that trust in the students feeling like they can come forward. Thanks.